The German MP41, officially designated Maschinenpistole 41, represents one of the most peculiar chapters in World War II small arms development, a weapon born from bureaucratic confusion, manufacturing ambition, and the clash between old and new design philosophies. This is the story of a hybrid submachine gun that nobody expected, a weapon that combined the best and worst of two generations of German firearms technology, and ultimately became a footnote in history, despite being produced in quantities that would surprise most historians. To understand the MP41, we must first travel back to the trenches of the First World War, where the entire concept of the submachine gun was born. In December 1917, at the height of the Great War, a talented German gunsmith named Hugo Schmeisser patented what he described as a light machine gun chambered for 9x19mm ammunition, though we would recognize it today as something quite different. The weapon that emerged from his design work would be designated the Bergmann MP18, and it would fundamentally change the nature of infantry combat. The MP18 was created to address a very specific problem facing the German army. Traditional bolt-action rifles, while accurate at range, were painfully slow in the close quarters nightmare of trench warfare. Machine guns provided firepower, but were heavy, crew-served weapons that couldn't be easily manoeuvred through the labyrinthine trench systems. The German Sturmtruppen, specialized assault groups trained in infiltration tactics, needed something entirely new. They needed a weapon that was light enough for one man to carry, provided automatic fire for clearing trenches, and could be brought into action instantly. The MP18 was revolutionary. It featured a simple blowback operation, firing from an open bolt with a cyclic rate of around 400 to 500 rounds per minute. Early versions fed from the same 32-round snail drum magazine used by the artillery Luger pistol, a solution that was practical but not ideal. The weapon was built to near commercial-grade quality, with parts fitted by hand at the Bergmann Waffenfabrik factory. By the end of 1917, the German army had ordered 50,000 of these new weapons, though only around 17,000 to perhaps 10,000, depending on sources, actually reached the front lines before the armistice. Despite arriving too late to change the outcome of the war, the MP18 proved its worth in the final German offensives of 1918. Sturmtruppen armed with these weapons could advance through enemy trenches with devastating speed, spraying automatic fire that cleared positions in seconds. The concept was vindicated, and though Germany lost the war, the submachine gun had been born. After the Treaty of Versailles, German submachine gun production was officially banned, but as with many provisions of the treaty, clever minds found loopholes. The Weimar Republic was permitted to maintain small quantities of submachine guns for police use, and German designers simply classified their new weapons as police equipment. Hugo Schmeisser, working now for the C.G. Haenel Company in Suhl, continued developing the MP18 design. In 1928, an improved version appeared, logically designated the MP28. The MP28 incorporated several improvements over its predecessor. Most significantly, it abandoned the awkward snail drum magazine in favour of straight box magazines holding 32 rounds, based on modifications developed by the French after the war. The weapon featured a fire selector that allowed both single shots and fully automatic fire, a major advantage over the automatic-only MP18. The rear sight was upgraded to an adjustable tangent sight graduated to an optimistic 194 yards, though effective combat range remained much shorter. The recoil spring was redesigned with a wider diameter for improved reliability. The MP28 was manufactured initially in Belgium by Pieper to circumvent German production restrictions, but by the mid-1930s, as the Nazi regime openly discarded the Treaty of Versailles, domestic production began at Haenel. The weapon was offered for export in multiple chamberings including 9x19mm Parabellum, 7.65 by 21mm, 7.63 by 25mm Mauser, and even 45 ACP. It saw considerable international success, being adopted by Belgium in 1934 and exported to Portugal, China, various South American countries and numerous other nations. The Spanish Republic even produced unlicensed copies during the Civil War under the codename Avispero. The MP28 represented refined first-generation submachine gun design. Well-made weapons constructed with traditional machining techniques, featuring wooden stocks and careful hand-fitting. They were reliable, accurate, and effective, but they were also time-consuming and expensive to produce. By the late 1930s, as another European war loomed, it was becoming clear that traditional manufacturing methods would be insufficient for the mass armies Germany intended to field. In 1938, having observed the lessons of the Spanish Civil War, where submachine guns proved devastatingly effective in urban combat, the German army instructed weapons designer Berthold Geipel of Erfurter Maschinenfabrik, better known as ERMA, to produce a new submachine gun to military specifications. Geipel had been working on just such a design for some time, building on his earlier ERMA EMP submachine gun and a prototype known as the MP36. With input from Heinrich Vollmer and incorporating some design elements from Hugo Schmeisser's patents, particularly the magazine system, the team created something revolutionary. The weapon that emerged broke entirely with submachine gun tradition. It featured no wood whatsoever in its construction, relying entirely on steel and Bakelite plastic. The stock was a simple folding metal frame that collapsed forward under the barrel, reducing the weapon's length for storage and transport. The receiver was a smooth steel tube that could be manufactured quickly with minimal machining. The bolt design incorporated a telescoping return spring guide, another Schmeisser innovation, that provided a compact, reliable operating system. This weapon was adopted in 1938 as the MP38, and it represented second-generation submachine gun design. Where the MP18 and MP28 were essentially automatic carbines with wooden furniture, the MP38 was purpose-built for mechanized warfare. It was designed for vehicle crews, paratroopers, and squad leaders who needed a compact, powerful weapon that could be deployed instantly. The pistol grip was angled for instinctive pointing, made from Bakelite to save weight and steel. A rest bar ran under the barrel, designed specifically to support the weapon when firing over the side of open-topped armoured vehicles like the Stekev's 251 half-track. The weapon fired only in full automatic mode with a relatively controllable cyclic rate of around 500 rounds per minute. It fed from a 32-round single stack, double-feed magazine that inserted from below at a slight forward angle. The MP38 was an excellent weapon, but it had one critical flaw. Despite its revolutionary design, it was still largely manufactured using conventional machining methods. Each receiver required careful work on precision machinery. The aluminum components, while lightweight, consumed scarce materials and required skilled labour. As Germany mobilized for war, these limitations became increasingly apparent. After the weapon proved itself during the Polish campaign of 1939, the German army requested a version that could be mass-produced more easily using wartime manufacturing techniques. The result was the MP40, introduced in 1940. To the casual observer, the MP38 and MP40 are nearly identical. Both share the same basic layout, the same folding stock, the same operating mechanism. But the differences, while subtle, were significant from a manufacturing perspective. The MP40's body was constructed from stamped sheet steel, formed and welded rather than machined from solid stock. The magazine housing was ribbed for additional strength rather than plain. The body top was plain instead of ribbed. Most importantly, the cocking handle was redesigned to include a safety feature. On early MP38s, if the weapon was dropped on its butt while loaded, the bolt could jar loose and fire. This deficiency caused several tragic accidents. The MP40's cocking handle could be pressed inward when the bolt was forward, engaging an enlarged portion of the handle in a milled slot that positively locked the bolt and prevented discharge if dropped. Production was distributed among multiple manufacturers including ERMA, Steyr-Daimler-Puch in Austria, and yes, CG Henel, where Hugo Schmeisser served as chief designer. Between 1940 and 1945, approximately 1.1 million MP40s were produced, making it one of the most numerous submachine guns of the war. The weapon became iconic, so closely associated with German forces that Allied troops universally called it the Schmeisser, despite Hugo Schmeisser having nothing to do with its design beyond his patented magazine system. The MP40 equipped German infantrymen throughout the war. Its distinctive profile, the slender barrel with the simple front sight, the skeletal folding stock, the angled forward magazine, became instantly recognizable on newsreels and in combat. Allied soldiers who captured these weapons often used them in preference to their issued arms. The MP40 was reliable, controllable, and devastatingly effective in close quarters. Its only significant weakness was that magazine, which could cause feeding problems if used as a handhold or if dirt entered the mechanism. But properly trained soldiers learned to grip the weapon by its body or stock. It is at this point in 1941 that our story properly begins. Hugo Schmeisser, now in his late 50s, had watched the evolution of the submachine gun from its birth. He had designed the MP18, he had improved it with the MP28. Now, working for Henel, which was manufacturing MP40s under contract, he apparently decided that the current generation of weapons had lost something important. The MP38 and MP40 were excellent weapons for vehicle crews and specialized troops, but for regular infantry, they had certain limitations. The folding metal stock, while compact, was not particularly comfortable or stable for aimed fire. The automatic-only fire mode meant ammunition consumption was difficult to control. The weapon lacked the traditional feel of a shoulder-fired rifle that infantry had trained with for generations. Schmeisser believed he could create something better by combining the modern manufacturing efficiency of the MP40 with the traditional ergonomics and features of his earlier MP28 design. The result would be the MP41. The MP41 was, in essence, a hybrid. Schmeisser took the entire upper receiver assembly of the MP40, the receiver tube, the bolt, the firing pin, the telescope spring system, the magazine well, all of it, and mated it to a completely different lower receiver derived from the MP28. This new lower section featured a traditional wooden shoulder stock rather than a folding metal frame. The pistol grip was wooden rather than Bakelite. Most significantly, it incorporated a selective fire trigger mechanism with a crossbolt selector switch, allowing the shooter to choose between single shots and automatic fire, something the MP40 lacked. The connection between these two very different components required a new solution, and Schmeisser filed a patent application in August 1941 for the method of joining thin-walled steel receiver tubes to wooden stocks and lower receivers. This patent was also registered in Switzerland and France in early 1942, suggesting international marketing was considered. The weapon that emerged was marked on the receiver with MP41 patent Schmeisser, CG Henel Suhl. This marking itself was unusual. By 1941, Germany used a code system for weapons manufacturers, with Henel assigned the code XO. This code appears on Henel-manufactured MP40s and later on the MKB42 machine carbines. But the MP41 bore the company's full name, not a code, suggesting it may have been considered a commercial venture, or perhaps an export weapon rather than standard military issue. The MP41 used the same 32-round magazines as the MP40, with one small difference. Where MP40 magazines were stamped with manufacturer codes, MP41 magazines bore the Henel name in an arrow, again suggesting a certain separation from standard military production. Specifications of the MP41 were nearly identical to the MP40. It fired the standard 9 by 19mm Parabellum cartridge with a cyclic rate of around 500 rounds per minute in automatic mode. The barrel length was 250mm, the same as the MP40. Overall length was 860mm, slightly longer than the MP40 with stock extended due to the fixed wooden stock. Weight was approximately 3.87 kilograms empty, somewhat heavier than the MP40's 3.97 kilograms due to the solid wood furniture. Effective range remained 150 to 200 meters, standard for submachine guns of the period. From a shooter's perspective, the MP41 offered certain advantages. The wooden stock provided a more stable shooting platform for aimed fire. The selective fire capability allowed better ammunition management, important in extended engagements. The weapon had a more traditional rifle-like feel that many soldiers found comfortable. The sights borrowed from the MP40 were the same simple dual V-notch system graduated for 100 and 200 meters. From a manufacturing perspective, however, the MP41 was a step backward. At a time when Germany desperately needed weapons that could be produced quickly, with minimal skilled labor and scarce materials, the MP41 required wood, required more machining for the lower receiver, required hand-fitting of the selective fire mechanism. It consumed resources without offering any significant tactical advantage over the MP40 that was already in mass production. But none of this mattered because the MP41's production run would be cut short for an entirely different reason: patent law. In late 1941, Irma Werke, the company that had developed the MP38 and held patents on its design, filed a lawsuit against CG Henel alleging patent infringement. The argument was straightforward. Schmeisser had taken Irma's MP40 upper receiver design, which was derived from Irma's MP38 and ultimately from Irma's MP36 prototype, and used it without authorization in the MP41. The fact that Hänel was manufacturing MP40s under license did not, in Irma's view, give Schmeisser the right to incorporate those design elements into a new weapon that competed with the MP40. The lawsuit was successful. Hänel was ordered to cease production of the MP41. The total number manufactured remains somewhat uncertain, with various sources citing figures between 26,700 and 27,000 units. This may seem like a substantial quantity, and it is, but consider that over 1 million MP40s were produced, and the MP41's production run lasted less than a year compared to the MP40's 5-year run. So what happened to these approximately 27,000 MP41s that were produced? Here the historical record becomes somewhat murky, but we can piece together the story from various sources. The German military itself never officially adopted the MP41 as standard issue. The Heer, the regular army, continued using the MP40. However, the SS, which maintained separate supply chains and procurement systems, did purchase substantial quantities. The Waffen-SS, the combat arm of the SS organization, issued MP41s to some units, particularly in 1944 as weapon shortages became acute. The SD, the Sicherheitsdienst or security service headed by Reinhard Heydrich, reportedly favoured the weapon for field units. Some sources suggest SD operatives appreciated the selective fire capability for operations where automatic fire might not always be appropriate. German police units, including the Ordnungspolizei, received MP41s. Specialised Luftwaffe ground units, particularly airfield security troops, were also issued the weapon. But the largest recipient of MP41s was Germany's ally, Romania. Romanian forces received substantial shipments, likely the majority of MP41 production. This makes sense from several perspectives. Romania was a significant Axis partner on the Eastern Front, and Germany had various weapons supply arrangements with Romanian forces. Exporting weapons that the German military had not officially adopted was politically easier than admitting those weapons had been produced despite having no military requirement. The MP41, with its traditional wooden stock and selective fire, may have been seen as more suitable for Romanian troops who were less mechanized than German forces. Romanian soldiers used the MP41 throughout the war on the Eastern Front, where the weapon proved effective if not revolutionary. The combination of modern MP40 reliability with traditional rifle ergonomics suited Romanian infantry tactics. After the war, MP41s remained in Romanian service for some years before being gradually retired as Soviet weapons became standard for Warsaw Pact nations. The MP41 saw combat across multiple theatres. SS units used them on both the Eastern and Western fronts. The weapon appeared in the brutal urban fighting at Stalingrad, in the hedgerows of Normandy during the Battle of the Bulge. Police units employed them in anti-partisan operations and rear area security duties, but the MP41 never achieved the iconic status of its parent designs. It was never common enough to be instantly recognised. It occupied an awkward middle ground, not quite an MP28, not quite an MP40, but something in between. To understand why the MP41 failed to make a larger impact, we must examine the broader context of German submachine gun development during World War II. By 1941, the Germans were also recognising certain limitations in their submachine gun philosophy. The MP40 was excellent for close-range engagements, with its 9mm pistol cartridge being controllable and effective within 100 to 150 metres. But beyond that range, German infantry armed with submachine guns were outgunned by Soviet troops with semi-automatic rifles or by American forces with their M1 Garans. The German army had identified a fundamental gap in their small arms inventory. The Karabiner 98K bolt-action rifle was accurate and powerful at long range but slow firing. The MP40 provided high volume fire at close range but lacked reach. What was needed was something in between, a weapon that could engage effectively at 300 to 400 metres while still providing automatic fire when needed. This realisation led to one of the most significant developments in firearms history, the assault rifle. In the early 1930s, German ammunition designers had developed an intermediate cartridge, the 7.92 by 33mm Kurz round. This was essentially a shortened version of the standard 7.92 by 57mm Mauser rifle cartridge, using the same diameter bullet but with a 24mm shorter case and half the propellant. The result was a cartridge more powerful than pistol ammunition, but less powerful than full rifle cartridges, offering a compromise between controllability and automatic fire and effective range. By 1942, Hugo Schmeisser, the same designer who created the MP41, had developed a prototype weapon for this cartridge while working at Haenel. This weapon, designated the MK42H for Maschine Karabiner 42 Haenel, was a selective fire rifle feeding from a 30-round detachable magazine. It used a gas-operated tilting bolt mechanism rather than the simple blowback of submachine guns, necessary to handle the more powerful intermediate cartridge. Field trials in late 1942 and early 1943 on the Eastern Front proved extremely promising. Soldiers equipped with these weapons could effectively engage Soviet troops at medium range while also providing suppressive automatic fire, something neither the 98K nor the MP40 could do alone. Adolf Hitler initially ordered development stopped, concerned about ammunition logistics and the resources required for a new weapon system. But the MKB-42H was too successful to abandon. Development continued under different designations. The weapon became the MP43, officially designated as a submachine gun to avoid Hitler's ban on new rifle development. This designation was technically incorrect since it fired a rifle cartridge, but it allowed work to continue. In April 1944, it was redesignated MP44. Finally, after its battlefield success could no longer be ignored, Hitler himself reportedly renamed it the Sturmgewehr 44, assault rifle 44, a propaganda term that stuck. The STG-44 represented everything the MP41 was not. While the MP41 looked backward to wooden-stocked submachine guns of the 1920s, the STG-44 looked forward to the future of infantry weapons. It was manufactured entirely from stampings, pressings, and weldings, requiring minimal machining. It could be produced quickly even as German industrial capacity declined. It offered capabilities no other weapon could match, effective fire from close range out to 300 meters and beyond. By war's end, approximately 425,000 STG-44s had been produced. Though this was too few and too late to change Germany's fate, the weapon profoundly influenced post-war firearms development. The Soviet AK-47, introduced in 1947, followed the same design philosophy of an intermediate cartridge in a selective fire weapon with a large capacity magazine. The American M16, adopted 2 decades later, likewise embraced the assault rifle concept. The STG-44 established that the future of infantry weapons lay not in traditional rifles or submachine guns, but in a hybrid that combined the best characteristics of both. In this context, the MP41 appears even more anachronistic. While Schmeisser was simultaneously working on the revolutionary MKB-42H that would become the STG-44, he was also developing the MP41, essentially an improved version of technology from the 1920s. This speaks to a fascinating tension in German weapons development during the war. On one hand, designers were creating genuinely revolutionary weapons like the STG-44, the MG-42 machine gun, the Panzerfaust anti-tank weapon. On the other hand, there was constant pressure to improve existing designs, to find incremental advantages, to never stop tinkering. The MP41 emerged from this culture of continuous refinement, but it was refinement of the wrong weapon at the wrong time. Other submachine gun developments during the war further illustrate German approaches to small arms. The MP40 itself saw several variants. The MP40/2, not to be confused with the MP41, was a modified version featuring a dual side-by-side magazine holder designed for the Eastern Front. The idea was to counter Soviet PPS-41 submachine guns, which used 71-round drum magazines, giving Soviet troops significant ammunition capacity advantage in firefights. The MP40/1 that allowed 232-round magazines to be loaded side by side for a total of 64 rounds available without reloading. However, the design proved problematic. The dual magazine holder added significant weight, making the weapon front-heavy and unwieldy. More critically, reliability issues plagued the system. The lateral sliding bracket that allowed switching between magazines was prone to jamming, particularly in the mud, dust, and cold of the Eastern Front. The MP40/2 was produced in limited numbers and saw limited use, another attempt at improvement that failed to deliver meaningful advantages. Late war desperation led to even more unusual submachine gun concepts. There were attempts to develop ultra-simplified weapons that could be manufactured by less skilled labour as German industry collapsed. Some of these so-called Volkssturmwaffen, or people's militia weapons, were little more than crude tubes with firing pins. But even in 1945, with Germany facing imminent defeat, submachine gun production continued. The MP40 remained in production until factories were overrun or destroyed. Captured German warehouses contained tens of thousands of weapons that had been manufactured but never distributed. The Soviets seized approximately 200,000 STG-44s and MP40s from depots after the war, many still in their shipping crates. This reveals another aspect of the MP41 story. Production numbers, while seemingly definitive, don't tell us how many weapons actually reached troops. Of those 27,000 MP41s manufactured, how many were issued? How many sat in warehouses? How many were lost to Allied bombing of transportation networks? The fragmented records make it impossible to say with certainty, but we know substantial numbers did see combat, because captured examples appeared in Allied intelligence reports, and enough survived to be collectible today. The technical merits of the MP41 as a weapon deserve consideration independent of its production and distribution history. Soldiers who used the weapon generally gave positive reports. The wooden stock was comfortable and stable, particularly appreciated by troops who had trained on traditional rifles. The selective fire mechanism worked reliably, the crossbolt selector being simple and intuitive. The weapon was accurate for a submachine gun, capable of hitting man-sized targets consistently at 100 meters and occasionally beyond, though effective aimed fire beyond 150 meters remained difficult with 9mm ammunition. The sights, while simple, were adequate for the weapon's intended range. Reliability was generally good, inheriting the proven MP40 operating system. The blowback mechanism was simple and robust, with few parts to break. The telescoping spring guide provided consistent cycling. The weapon could function in extreme cold, crucial on the Eastern Front, and tolerated dirt and dust reasonably well, though like all submachine guns it required regular cleaning to maintain reliability. Magazine. Compatibility with the standard MP40 magazines was a significant advantage. Supply chains already existed for these magazines, and soldiers equipped with MP41s could scavenge magazines from disabled MP40s or vice versa. The rate of fire, around 500 rounds per minute, was controllable even in full automatic mode. Experienced shooters could fire accurate bursts of 3 to 5 rounds, though this required practice and discipline. Recoil was moderate, the weapon's weight and the relatively low-powered 9mm cartridge combining to produce manageable impulse. Disassembly for cleaning was straightforward, requiring no tools. The weapon could be field stripped in under a minute by trained soldiers. The main components, receiver, bolt assembly, barrel, stock and trigger group, were simple to separate and reassemble. This ease of maintenance was crucial in combat conditions where detailed weapons cleaning might not always be possible. However, the MP41 also inherited certain limitations from its parent designs. The magazine, using the single-stack, double-feed system patented by Schmeisser, was prone to feeding problems if used as a handhold or if bent. The feed lips were relatively fragile and could be damaged by rough handling or drops. Soldiers were trained to avoid using magazines as grips, but in combat stress this training was often forgotten. The short barrel, while convenient for close quarters, resulted in significant muzzle flash and blast. In low-light conditions, firing the weapon could temporarily blind the shooter. The muzzle blast was also fatiguing during extended firing sessions. The sights, while adequate, were not adjustable for windage and elevation beyond the basic 100-200 meter notches. Precision shooting beyond 100 meters required Kentucky windage, holding off target to compensate for bullet drop and wind drift. The barrel lacked any insulation or heat shielding. After extended firing, the barrel became hot enough to cause burns if touched. The simple barrel shroud provided minimal protection for the support hand. The fixed wooden stock, while comfortable, eliminated the compactness advantage of the MP40's folding stock. The weapon was longer and more awkward to store and transport. For vehicle crews and paratroopers, this was a significant disadvantage. Weight was slightly higher than the MP40, and every gram mattered to soldiers carrying full combat loads. The difference between 3.97 and 387 kilograms might seem trivial, but added to ammunition, grenades, entrenching tools, rations, and all the other equipment of war, it contributed to overall burden. Production complexity, as mentioned earlier, was higher than the streamlined MP40. The wooden stock required wood, a material that needed to be sourced, dried, shaped, and finished. The selective fire mechanism required additional machining and hand-fitting. These factors made the weapon more expensive and slower to produce than the MP40. In retrospect, the MP41 represents a road not taken in submachine gun development. Schmeisser's vision of combining modern manufacturing with traditional ergonomics had merit, but it came too late and addressed the wrong problem. What German infantry needed in 1941 was not a better submachine gun, but a weapon that bridged the gap between submachine guns and rifles. The STG-44 would eventually provide this, but for most of the war, German soldiers made do with a combination of bolt-action rifles and submachine guns. The Allied powers faced similar challenges and arrived at different solutions. The Soviet Union, recognizing the value of massed automatic fire in their tactics, equipped vast numbers of troops with PPSH-41 and PPS-43 submachine guns, accepting their limited range in exchange for overwhelming close-range firepower. The British, after early reliance on the Thompson submachine gun, developed the Sten gun, a weapon even more austere than the MP40, manufactured from simple stampings and weldings at incredibly low cost. The Sten was ugly, uncomfortable, and somewhat unreliable, but it was cheap and available in enormous quantities. The Americans took a middle approach. The Thompson submachine gun remained in production, an expensive but excellent weapon, but they also developed the M3 grease gun, another simplified design influenced by captured MP40s. Meanwhile, the M1 Garand semi-automatic rifle gave American infantry reach and firepower that German submachine gun-equipped troops could not match. The United States also developed the M1 and M2 carbines, lightweight weapons firing an intermediate cartridge, not unlike the German Kurz round, though the carbine's cartridge was less powerful and the weapons lacked full automatic capability until the late-war M2 variant. The Japanese, despite their industrial limitations, produced the Type 100 submachine gun, heavily influenced by the German MP28. Production was minimal, only about 7,500 units, but it demonstrated the global influence of German submachine gun design. The MP41 itself had negligible influence on post-war weapons development. Unlike the MP40, which influenced designs like the Spanish Star Z45 and Yugoslav Zastava M56, or the STG-44, which influenced virtually all subsequent assault rifles, the MP41 was simply forgotten. Most firearms historians classify it as a variant of the MP40 rather than a distinct weapons system, and many are unaware it existed at all. Collectors prize MP41s for their rarity, with examples commanding premium prices at auction, but this is scarcity-driven value rather than recognition of historical significance. After the war, surviving MP41s had various fates. Those in Romanian hands remained in service for some years before being replaced by Soviet designs. Examples captured by the Soviets may have been supplied to client states and guerrilla movements, as was common with captured German weapons, though documentation is scarce. The Soviets were known to have distributed captured STG-44s and MP40s widely, and MP41s may have been included in these transfers. Examples turned up in conflicts across the Middle East and Africa decades after the war, though whether these were MP41s or the more common MP40 is often unclear from historical photographs. Some weapons were brought back as war trophies by Allied soldiers. American, British and Soviet veterans returned home with captured German firearms as souvenirs. MP41s, being unusual, were attractive trophies for those aware enough to recognize their rarity. Today, these trophy weapons form the core of MP41s available to collectors. Legal deactivated examples, following BATF guidelines with barrels welded to dummy receivers and 2 inches of the receiver replaced by solid bar stock, change hands in the collector market. Original firing examples exist in the hands of licensed dealers and museums, but are exceptionally rare. The rarity is worth emphasizing. Of the approximately 27,000 MP41s produced, perhaps 10,000 went to Romania, several thousand to the SS, a few thousand to police and Luftwaffe units. Many were lost in combat, destroyed in the fighting, captured and never recovered. More were scrapped after the war as surplus. Conservative estimates suggest fewer than 1,000 MP41s survive today worldwide, and perhaps only 100 to 200 are in documented collections. Compare this to the MP40, where tens of thousands of examples survive, or even the STG-44, where despite much tighter post-war controls on military weapons, thousands of examples exist in collections and museums. The MP41's scarcity ensures it remains an enigma, a weapon most people have never heard of despite its reasonable production numbers. The patent dispute that ended MP41 production highlights an often overlooked aspect of wartime weapons manufacture. Even during total war, legal considerations mattered. Irma's lawsuit against Henel was not dismissed as unimportant compared to military needs. Rather, German authorities respected the patent system, recognizing that industrial firms needed protection for their intellectual property, or they would have no incentive to innovate. This stands in interesting contrast to the common perception of Nazi Germany as lawless. While the regime was certainly criminal in its broader policies, technical and commercial law continued to function relatively normally. Companies competed for contracts, protected their patents, negotiated terms. The weapons industry operated within a framework of regulations, standards, and legal requirements. The lawsuit also reveals tension between German arms manufacturers. Irma and Henel were competitors as well as partners in the war effort. Henel manufacturing MP40s under license did not eliminate the rivalry. When Schmeisser developed the MP41, Irma saw it as both patent violation and commercial threat. If the MP41 had proven superior and replaced the MP40 in production, Irma would have lost substantial contracts. The lawsuit was therefore both legal, principle, and business strategy. Hugo Schmeisser himself deserves closer examination. Born in 1884, he was the son of Louis Schmeisser, who had developed important firearms innovations in the late 19th century. Hugo inherited his father's talent, and by the First World War was already an accomplished designer. His MP117 was his first major success, but hardly his last. The MP28, the MKB-42H that led to the STG-44, and numerous other weapons and mechanisms bore his stamp. Yet his name became most associated with a weapon he didn't design, the MP40, because Allied soldiers called every German submachine gun a Schmeisser. This was understandable. The name was prominently stamped on magazines due to his magazine patent, and the weapons used his magazine system, and some incorporated his recoil spring designs. But the conflation frustrated Schmeisser in post-war interviews. He was proud of his actual designs, and somewhat resentful that his name had become generic slang. The MP41, ironically, was one of the few weapons that legitimately bore his name as designer, yet remained obscure. He combined his own earlier MP28 design elements with his patented operating system as used in the MP40 to create something he believed was better than either, and then watched it be shut down by legal action. After the war, Schmeisser was captured by the Soviets and forced to work on weapons development in the USSR for several years before being allowed to return to East Germany. He died in 1953, his legacy secure but complicated. The MP41 story also illuminates the chaotic nature of German weapons procurement during the war. Multiple agencies had authority over different aspects of production. The Heereswaffenamt, Army Weapons Office, controlled development of weapons for the regular army, but the SS had its own procurement system. The Luftwaffe made independent decisions for Air Force ground troops. Police agencies had separate chains of supply. This fragmentation meant weapons like the MP41 could be produced and issued even without official military adoption. If the SS wanted them, the SS could buy them. If Romania requested them, export could be arranged. This was inefficient, leading to proliferation of weapon types and complicated logistics, but it also allowed innovation and competition between designs. Comparing the MP41 to its contemporaries provides context for its place in weapons development. The British Sten gun, introduced in 1941, was extraordinarily crude by comparison. Stamped from sheet metal with a side-mounted magazine and minimal furniture, it looked like a plumber's nightmare. But it cost a fraction of the MP40 or MP41 to produce, and could be manufactured in small workshops with minimal tooling. Britain produced over 4 million Stens during the war. The Soviet PPSH-41, also introduced in 1941, took a different approach. It featured a wooden stock like the MP41, but combined this with stamped metal construction and either a 71-round drum magazine or 35-round stick magazine. It was simple, reliable, and produced in vast quantities, over 6 million units. Soviet tactics emphasized short-range automatic fire, and the PPS enabled this at a scale the Germans could not match. The American M3 grease gun, introduced in 1943, was another ultra-simplified design. It cost about $20 to manufacture, compared to over $200 for a Thompson, and it performed adequately in close combat. Compared to these mass production philosophies, the MP41 feels like a luxury item, a carefully finished hybrid weapon created in a war that increasingly had no time for such things. German industry, under relentless Allied bombing and material shortages, was forced toward ever greater simplification. The MP41 stood at the opposite end of that trajectory, a reminder of pre-war craftsmanship surviving briefly into an era that no longer supported it. Another important aspect of the MP41 story lies in training doctrine. German infantry doctrine prior to the war emphasized marksmanship and controlled fire. Soldiers were trained extensively with bolt-action rifles and expected to engage targets deliberately rather than relying on volume of fire. Submachine guns were originally seen as specialist weapons, issued to squad leaders, assault troops, and vehicle crews. The MP40 fit this role perfectly. It was compact, fast-handling, and ideal for short, violent engagements. The MP41, with its selective fire and wooden stock, aligned more closely with traditional infantry doctrine, encouraging aimed semi-automatic fire. But by the time it appeared, battlefield realities were shifting. The Eastern Front in particular demanded enormous volumes of suppressive fire. Soviet tactics relied on massed infantry assaults supported by automatic weapons. German units increasingly needed every man to contribute to firepower, not just precision. In this environment, the distinction between riflemen and submachine gunners began to blur, and the assault rifle concept emerged as the ultimate solution. The MP41 was therefore doctrinally out of step with the direction warfare was moving. There is also the question of ergonomics and human factors. While many soldiers appreciated the wooden stock, others preferred the MP40's compactness. Urban combat, trench fighting, and operations inside buildings favoured shorter weapons. The MP41's fixed stock made it slightly more cumbersome in confined spaces. While not a dramatic difference, these small factors mattered in close combat. The MP40 could be slung, folded, and manoeuvred through tight doorways and vehicle hatches more easily. For mechanized troops, this was decisive. The MP41 felt more like a traditional shoulder weapon, better suited to open terrain than cramped interiors. This again limited its appeal to certain units, while the MP40 remained universally useful. The MP41's place in German weapons history is also shaped by timing. Had it appeared earlier, say in the mid-1930s, it might have found a meaningful role as a transition weapon between the MP28 and MP40. Had it appeared later, perhaps simplified and adapted for mass production, it might have competed with emergency weapons like the MP3008. But appearing in 1941, at a moment when Germany needed maximum output with minimum complexity, it was squeezed out by circumstances. It was neither modern enough to justify continued production, nor obsolete enough to fill a niche as a stopgap. The Romanian connection deserves further reflection because it illustrates how German weapons circulated beyond the Wehrmacht. Romania entered the war with a mixture of domestic and imported weapons, including Czech, French, and German designs. Romanian industry lacked the capacity to produce advanced automatic weapons in large numbers, making imports essential. The MP41, being available but unwanted by the German army, filled this gap. Romanian troops used it alongside MP40s, MP28s, and later Soviet-captured weapons. Reports suggest Romanian soldiers found the MP41 reliable and easy to maintain, qualities that mattered greatly on the Eastern Front where logistics were strained and conditions brutal. In freezing winters and muddy summers, the simple blowback system continued to function when more complex mechanisms struggled. For Romania, the MP41 was not an oddity, but a practical infantry weapon during some of the hardest fighting of the war. After Romania switched sides in August 1944, joining the Allies, many MP41s would have ended up in Soviet hands. The Red Army was pragmatic about captured weapons, often issuing them to rear echelon units or passing them on to Allied forces. While the Soviets preferred their own designs, they did not hesitate to use German submachine guns when supplies demanded it. This further scattered MP41s across Eastern Europe, complicating efforts to track their post-war history. Some may have been used briefly by Soviet internal security units, or by newly formed Eastern Bloc forces before being phased out in favour of standardised Soviet weapons. In Western Europe, MP41s captured by Allied forces were studied alongside other German weapons. Allied intelligence reports catalogued German small arms in great detail, noting differences between MP38, MP40 and MP41 variants. These reports helped Allied planners understand German capabilities and anticipate enemy firepower. However, the MP41 never prompted any particular concern. It was treated as a minor variant rather than a new threat. Its presence did not alter Allied tactics or equipment choices. This lack of impact further relegated it to obscurity. From a modern historical perspective, the MP41 is fascinating precisely because it sits at the intersection of multiple trends. It embodies the craftsmanship of early submachine guns, the industrial efficiency of mid-war designs, and the transitional thinking that preceded the assault rifle revolution. It shows how designers like Schmeisser were not locked into a single vision but explored multiple solutions simultaneously. While working on the STG-44, a weapon that would define the future, Schmeisser was also refining the past. This duality speaks to the uncertainty of wartime development. No one knew which ideas would prove decisive, and designers pursued multiple paths in parallel. The MP41 also highlights the importance of institutional support in weapons adoption. Technical merit alone is rarely enough. A weapon must fit doctrine, logistics, production capacity, and political realities. The MP41 failed not because it was a bad weapon, but because it lacked a powerful institutional champion. The Heer did not want it. Irma actively opposed it. The SS and export customers were not enough to sustain production in the face of legal challenges. Contrast this with the STG-44, which survived Hitler's opposition because frontline commanders and soldiers demanded it, and because its battlefield effectiveness was undeniable. The MP41 never inspired that level of advocacy. Collectors today often describe the MP41 as a weapon that feels unusually refined for a wartime submachine gun. The woodstock, the balance, the smooth trigger in semi-automatic mode all contribute to this impression. Firing demonstrations, where legal, show a controllable and accurate weapon, pleasant to shoot compared to many contemporaries. This reinforces the idea that the MP41 was a solution to a problem that no longer existed. It would have been ideal for a professional army fighting limited wars, not for a total war consuming millions of men and machines. Museums that display MP41s often struggle to explain them to the public. Without context, they look like MP40s with wooden stocks, leading casual observers to assume they are field modifications or post-war alterations. Only careful explanation reveals their unique origin and significance. This invisibility mirrors the weapon's historical fate. It existed, it served, it worked, and then it disappeared into the margins of history. The MP41's story also invites reflection on how history remembers technology. Iconic weapons become symbols not only because of their technical qualities, but because of how widely they were used, and how strongly they are associated with major events. The MP40 became iconic because it was everywhere, and because it appeared in countless photographs and films. The STG-44 became iconic because it represented a conceptual breakthrough. The MP41 did neither. It was never ubiquitous, and it did not represent a new idea. As a result, it faded from collective memory. Yet for historians, these marginal weapons are often the most revealing. They show what might have been, what designers valued, and how institutions made choices under pressure. The MP41 reveals a Germany still capable of producing finely made weapons, even as it moved toward industrial desperation. It reveals a designer unwilling to abandon his belief in traditional ergonomics even as he pioneered revolutionary concepts elsewhere. It reveals a legal and industrial system that continued to function amid chaos, enforcing patents even as cities burned. In the final analysis, the MP41 was a competent, well-designed, and thoughtfully conceived weapon that simply arrived at the wrong moment. It was overshadowed by its siblings, outpaced by technological change, and cut short by legal realities. It served quietly in the hands of SS troops, police units, and Allied soldiers, doing its job without fanfare. It did not change the course of the war, it did not inspire future generations of weapons designers. But it remains a compelling artifact of a turbulent era, a reminder that history is shaped not only by the successes that define the future, but also by the paths that briefly appeared promising before fading away. In that sense, the MP41 stands as a symbol of transition. It marks the end of the classic submachine gun era, where wood and steel met in carefully fitted designs, and the beginning of a new age defined by stamped metal, intermediate cartridges, and mass production. It is a footnote, but a meaningful one, telling us that even in the midst of total war, designers still argued about ergonomics, soldiers still cared about how a weapon felt in their hands, and the machinery of law and industry still mattered. The MP41 did not win fame, but it earned its place in the complex and often contradictory story of 20th century warfare.